Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I have a really beautiful, intense story for you today. But before we begin, I want to take a quick second to talk to you. If you enjoy these BL storytelling videos and want to support the continuation of this channel, you can join my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. As you probably know, YouTube does not always make it easy to monetize this kind of content, so Patreon really helps me keep creating these stories for you. You can find the link in the description and in the pinned comment. And for those of you who want the continuation of the videos, bonus scenes, early access, and more uncensored 18+ BL content, SpicyTimeBL is exactly where you can find it. Thank you so much for your support. It really means the world to me. Now, get comfortable, grab a warm drink, dim the lights, and let me tell you a story about boundaries, late nights, and what happens when the walls we build to protect ourselves finally come crashing down. Have you ever met someone who just completely terrified you, but at the same time, you couldn't look away from them? That's exactly how 24-year-old Elias felt the very first time he laid eyes on Julian Vance. Julian was 34, and he was the CEO and lead architect of Vance Design, one of the most prestigious architectural firms in the city. Julian was a legend in the industry. He was known for his brilliant, cutting-edge designs, his impeccable taste in tailored suits, and his absolutely ruthless, freezing cold personality. People didn't just work for Julian Vance. They survived him. He demanded perfection, and if you couldn't give it to him, he would tear your hard work to shreds without raising his voice a single decibel. And Elias? Elias was the absolute opposite. He was a junior architect, freshly hired, incredibly talented, but messy. He wore oversized sweaters. His hair was always falling into his eyes. He lived on cheap instant coffee, and he led with his heart. He didn't care about corporate politics. He cared about art, about spaces that made people feel alive. Getting a job at Vance Design was a dream come true for Elias, but it was also walking right into the lion's den. I want you to picture Elias on his very first day. It was raining, one of those heavy, gloomy city rains that makes everything look a little cinematic and a little lonely. Elias was rushing into the massive glass and steel lobby of the Vance building, completely drenched, carrying a ridiculously large cardboard tube full of his design blueprints. He was late, not by much, maybe 5 minutes, but for Elias, it felt like the end of the world. He scrambled toward the elevator, watching the silver doors slowly starting to close. "Hold it, please, hold the door," he yelled, sprinting across the marble floor. A hand, wearing a very expensive silver watch, reached out and stopped the door. Elias practically fell inside, gasping for breath, water dripping from his messy hair onto the pristine elevator floor. "Thank you," Elias panted, leaning against the wall, clutching his blueprints to his chest like a shield. "I thought I was going to die out there. If you cannot manage a simple schedule, I doubt your survival skills in this firm," a voice said. The voice was deep, it was smooth, but it had an edge to it that sent a shiver straight down Elias's spine. He looked up, wiping the rainwater from his eyes, and froze. Standing next to him, looking like he had just stepped out of a luxury magazine, was Julian Vance. Julian was tall, intimidatingly tall. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit that fit him so perfectly, it looked like armor. His dark hair was styled back, save for one stray lock, and his eyes. Elias would never forget those eyes. They were a piercing, icy shade of gray. They were the kind of eyes that looked right through you, dissecting all your flaws in a matter of seconds. Julian wasn't looking at Elias with anger. It was worse. It was total, blank indifference. He looked at Elias's wet sneakers, the damp, oversized sweater, and the chaotic bundle of blueprints, and his expression barely shifted. "First day?" Julian asked, his voice low, not breaking eye contact. Yes," Elias stammered, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt so small, so entirely out of his depth. Elias Thorne, junior architect. Julian slowly looked at the floor indicator as the elevator climbed up to the 50th floor. "Elias Thorne," Julian repeated, and the way he said Elias's name made Elias's breath hitch. "Let's see if you last the month, Mr. Thorne. Most don't." The doors opened with a soft ding. Julian stepped out without looking back, leaving Elias standing there, his heart racing, half terrified and half captivated. That was their first meeting, a collision of fire and ice. Elias told himself right then and there that he was not going to let Julian Vance break him. He was going to prove that he belonged here. But proving himself to Julian was like trying to scale a glass wall. Over the next 3 weeks, Elias learned exactly why everyone was terrified of the boss. Julian was a phantom that haunted the office. He worked insane hours, sometimes staying in his glass-walled corner office until the sun came up. He would walk through the drafting floor, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room, and stop behind people's desks. He wouldn't yell. He would just point at a line on a screen and say, "That is structurally weak. Start over." And that was it. Weeks of work, gone in 3 words. Elias, being the youngest and the newest, got the worst of it. He was assigned to draft the foundational plans for a new modern art museum, a massive project that Julian was personally overseeing, and Julian rejected every single draft Elias submitted. One evening, it was past 8 p.m. The office was mostly empty, the city lights twinkling outside the massive windows. Elias was sitting at his desk, rubbing his tired eyes, staring at his computer screen. He had redrawn the structural supports 5 times. 5 times, Julian had sent it back with a single red line through it. Elias was frustrated. He was exhausted, and most of all, he was angry. He grabbed his tablet, marched across the quiet office floor, and stood outside Julian's office. The glass door was slightly ajar. Julian was inside, standing by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking out at the city. He looked tired. For a split second, Elias didn't see the ruthless CEO. He saw a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, entirely alone in a glass cage of his own making. But Elias shook his head, pushing the thought away. He knocked on the glass. Julian didn't turn around immediately. "I don't remember calling for you, Mr. Thorne." "You didn't," Elias said, stepping into the office. The room smelled like expensive cedarwood, black coffee, and Julian's cologne. It was intoxicating. "But I need to know what you want from me. You've rejected my draft 5 times, Mr. Vance. The math is perfect. The structure is sound. The design flows naturally with the museum's aesthetic. Why do you keep throwing it out?" Julian slowly turned around. He set his glass down on his massive mahogany desk. He looked at Elias, his icy gray eyes narrowing slightly. He took a slow, deliberate step toward Elias, and then another, until he was standing just a few feet away. Elias had to tilt his head up slightly to meet his gaze, and his heart immediately started doing that frantic, fluttering thing it did whenever Julian was near. "Do you think architecture is just about math, Mr. Thorne?" Julian asked, his voice a low rumble. "No," Elias said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's about making people feel something." "Exactly," Julian said softly. He reached out and took the tablet from Elias's hands. As he did, his long, elegant fingers brushed against Elias's. The contact was brief, barely a second, but it felt like an electric shock. Elias actually gasped softly, pulling his hand back a fraction. Julian's eyes flicked down to Elias's hand, then back up to his face. For a moment, the air between them went completely still. It was heavy, thick with a sudden, strange tension that Elias didn't understand. Julian cleared his throat, looking down at the tablet. "Your math is perfect, yes," Julian said, his voice sounding just a tiny bit rougher than before. "But it has no soul. You are playing it safe. You are designing what you think I want to see, instead of what you actually want to build. You're afraid of me, Elias." It was the first time Julian had used his first name. Elias's stomach did a somersault. "I'm not afraid of you," Elias lied, his voice barely a whisper. Julian stepped even closer. The scent of cedar and warmth enveloped Elias. Julian leaned in slightly, his eyes tracing the line of Elias's jaw, before meeting his eyes again. "Prove it," Julian whispered. "Stop hiding behind safe lines. Show me who you really are on that paper. Have it on my desk by 8 a.m. Julian stepped back, the invisible magnetic pull between them suddenly snapping. "Good night, Elias." Elias stumbled out of the office, his face flushed, his heart beating so fast he thought he might pass out. What just happened? Why did the air feel like it had caught fire when Julian stood that close? Why did Julian's eyes look so intense, so deeply focused on him? Elias didn't go home that night. He stayed at his desk. He wiped the screen clean and started over. He stopped thinking about the rules. He stopped thinking about Julian's cold reputation. He thought about the man standing by the window, the loneliness, the strength. He poured all his raw, chaotic, passionate energy into the design. By 3 a.m., Elias couldn't keep his eyes open anymore. He rested his head on his arms on the desk, telling himself he would just close his eyes for 5 minutes. He fell fast asleep. An hour later, Julian walked out of his office, preparing to finally leave for the night. The drafting floor was dark, illuminated only by the glow of the city outside and one single desk lamp. Julian stopped in his tracks. He walked over silently. There was Elias, fast asleep, his face turned to the side, his lips slightly parted, breathing softly. The chaotic mess of his hair was falling over his eyes. Julian stood there in the quiet darkness, just watching him. The cold, ruthless mask that Julian wore every single day slowly melted away, leaving something incredibly soft, incredibly vulnerable in his eyes. Julian looked down at the tablet beneath Elias's arm. He gently slid it out to look at the design. Julian's breath caught in his throat. It was brilliant. It was breathtaking. It was a chaotic, beautiful, structural masterpiece. Elias had poured his soul into it. Julian stared at the screen, and then he looked back at the young man sleeping at the desk. A strange, heavy warmth blossomed in Julian's chest, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very, very long time. Julian took off his expensive suit jacket. Moving very slowly, very carefully, he draped the jacket over Elias's shoulders to keep him warm. He lingered for a moment, his hand resting near Elias's shoulder. He wanted to touch his hair. He wanted to brush that stray lock away from his forehead. Julian's fingers twitched, but he pulled his hand back, clenching it into a fist. He couldn't. He was the boss. Elias was his employee. It was entirely inappropriate. But God, as Julian walked away into the shadows of the office, he knew he was in serious trouble. The next morning, Elias woke up with a start, panicked that he had overslept. As he sat up, something heavy and warm slipped off his shoulders and fell onto his lap. Elias looked down. It was a dark, charcoal suit jacket. It smelled like cedar wood and expensive coffee. Julian's jacket. Elias stared at it, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked over at the glass corner office. Julian was already at his desk, talking on the phone, looking completely put together, as if he hadn't spent the night here too. Elias hugged the jacket to his chest for just a second, burying his nose in the collar. It smelled so good. It felt like a protective embrace. When Elias finally brought the jacket back to Julian's office, along with his finished design, Julian barely looked up from his computer. "I believe this is yours," Elias said softly, placing the jacket on the couch. "You left your design open on your tablet," Julian said, his voice flat, completely professional. "It is acceptable. We will use it for the final presentation. Good work, Mr. Thorne." Acceptable. That was the highest praise Julian Vance had ever given a junior architect in the history of the firm. Elias couldn't help the massive, bright smile that spread across his face. "Thank you, Mr. Vance." Julian finally looked up, and when he saw Elias's beaming, radiant smile, a microscopic crack appeared in Julian's icy exterior. For a fleeting second, the corner of Julian's mouth twitched upward. Was that a smile? Before Elias could process it, Julian looked back at his screen. "Get back to work, Elias." Things began to change after that night. It wasn't obvious at first. It was subtle. It was the way Julian would bring 2 cups of coffee back from the break room and silently place one on Elias's desk without saying a word. It was the way Elias would catch Julian staring at him from across the drafting floor, only for Julian to quickly look away when Elias noticed. A month passed, and the tension between them grew so thick you could cut it with a knife. It wasn't just a professional tension anymore. It was a heavy, magnetic pull. They were circling each other, completely aware of the gravity, but terrified to step too close. And then came the Aura Hotel project. It was the biggest contract the firm had ever landed, a luxury resort on a cliffside. Julian was under immense pressure from the board of directors to make it a masterpiece. One afternoon, Julian called Elias into his office and closed the blinds. That had never happened before. The glass walls turned opaque at the push of a button, cutting them off from the rest of the office. "The lead designer for the Aura project just quit," Julian said, pacing behind his desk, looking stressed, running a hand through his usually perfect hair. He couldn't handle the pressure. "The deadline is in 3 weeks. We have to redesign the entire West Wing." Elias stood there, nervous. "What are you going to do?" Julian stopped pacing and looked at Elias. Those intense gray eyes locked onto him. "I'm not doing it alone. I am temporarily promoting you to my direct assistant on this project. You will move your things into this office. You will work directly with me. Every day, every night, until it is done. Can you handle that, Elias? Work in Julian's office? Alone with him behind closed blinds for 3 weeks? Elias felt a thrill of panic and pure excitement rush through his veins. Yes, Elias said, his voice surprisingly steady. I won't let you down. And so began the most intense 3 weeks of Elias's life. They worked side by side. They spent 12, sometimes 14 hours a day locked in that office. And the more time they spent together, the more the professional boundaries began to blur. Elias learned that Julian liked classical music when he was stressed. He learned that Julian rubbed the bridge of his nose when he had a headache. He learned that underneath the cold CEO exterior, Julian was deeply passionate, incredibly kind, and intensely protective of the people he cared about. And Julian? Julian was falling apart. Every single day, having Elias so close was driving him out of his mind. He loved the way Elias laughed. He loved the way Elias would get so excited about a design that he would wave his hands around and knock things over. He loved the warmth Elias brought into the cold, sterile office. One evening, it was raining again. The rain was lashing against the large floor-to-ceiling windows of Julian's office. They were leaning over the massive drafting table in the center of the room, looking at a large printed blueprint. They were standing shoulder to shoulder, so close that Elias could feel the heat radiating from Julian's body. Elias was pointing at a section of the blueprint. If we curve the glass here, Elias said, his voice quiet in the dim room, it will catch the sunset perfectly. It'll feel like the room is glowing. Yes, Julian murmured, but he wasn't looking at the blueprint. Elias turned his head. Julian was looking right at him. They were mere inches apart. Elias's breath caught in his throat. Julian's eyes were dark, filled with an emotion so intense it made Elias feel dizzy. The silence in the room was deafening, save for the sound of the rain against the glass. Julian's gaze dropped to Elias's lips, and he swallowed hard. Elias felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He couldn't move. He didn't want to move. He found himself leaning in, just a fraction of an inch. Julian's hands slowly lifted from the table. His fingertips gently brushed against the knuckles of Elias's hand. It was a hesitant touch, asking for permission. Elias turned his hand over, his fingers trembling slightly, and let Julian's hand rest over his. The skin-on-skin contact sent a jolt of pure electricity through both of them. Julian leaned in closer, his breath ghosting over Elias's cheek. Elias, Julian whispered, his voice incredibly deep, incredibly fragile. Elias's eyes fluttered shut. He was ready. He wanted this so badly. Ring, ring, ring. The sharp, loud shrill of the office phone on Julian's desk shattered the moment like broken glass. Julian stepped back instantly, snapping out of the trance, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, turning away from Elias to stare out the rainy window. Elias stood there, his hand feeling cold where Julian had just been touching it. He took a shaky breath, trying to calm his racing heart. Julian answered the phone, his voice back to the cold, professional CEO tone, but Elias could see the white-knuckled grip he had on the edge of the desk. They didn't talk about it. They just went back to work. But everything was different now. The invisible line had been crossed. Before we move on to what happens next, I want to take a quick moment to remind you that if you love this story and want to hear more continuations, bonus scenes, early access to videos, and uncensored 18+ BL content, you can support me on SpicyTimeBL on Patreon. It's because of your support that I can keep writing and creating these intense, emotional stories for you. The link is in the description and the pinned comment below. Thank you so much for being here. Now, let's get back to Julian and Elias, because the tension in that office was about to reach a breaking point. A few days after the near kiss in the rain, the dynamic between them was incredibly charged. Every accidental brush of their shoulders, every shared glance, carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. But Julian was pulling back. The fear of ruining his professional integrity, of risking Elias's career, was making Julian build his icy walls back up. He was colder, more distant, and it was breaking Elias's heart. And then Marcus arrived. Marcus was the primary investor for the Aura Hotel project. He was a billionaire, young, charming, ridiculously handsome, and he was completely, unapologetically flirting with Elias. It started during a boardroom meeting. Marcus was sitting across from Elias, ignoring the presentation Julian was giving, and instead, smiling warmly at Elias. You know, Elias, Marcus interrupted Julian smoothly, leaning forward. Your vision for the West Wing is brilliant. We should discuss it over dinner tonight. Just the two of us. To brainstorm, of course. Elias blinked, slightly caught off guard. Oh, I'd love to, but I have a lot of revisions to finish. I insist, Marcus smiled, his eyes dropping to Elias's lips for just a second. It's on the company. At the head of the table, Julian stopped talking. The entire boardroom seemed to drop 10 degrees in temperature. Julian gripped the edge of the podium so hard his knuckles turned completely white. His jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful. Mr. Thorne is unavailable tonight, Julian said, his voice dangerously low, vibrating with a possessive authority that made everyone in the room freeze. He is required here, with me. Marcus raised an eyebrow, looking amused. I'm sure he needs to eat, Julian. I promise to bring him back in one piece. Julian's icy eyes locked onto Marcus, and if looks could kill, Marcus would have been incinerated on the spot. I said, he is unavailable. Let us return to the blueprints, Marcus, unless you have lost interest in your own investment. Elias sat there, his face burning bright red, his heart doing flips in his chest. He had never seen Julian act like this. It wasn't just professional authority, it was raw, primal jealousy. When the meeting finally ended and everyone filed out of the room, Elias stayed behind, packing up his tablet. Julian stood by the window, his back to Elias, his shoulders tense. You didn't have to do that, Elias said softly. I could have handled Marcus. Julian spun around, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He stopped right in front of Elias, invading his personal space. His chest was rising and falling heavily. He was looking at you like you were something on a menu, Elias, Julian growled, his voice stripped of all its usual polished control. So what if he was? Elias challenged, stepping closer instead of backing down, tilting his chin up to meet Julian's blazing eyes. Why do you care, Julian? Tell me why you care. Julian looked at him, his expression tortured. You know why, he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. No, I don't, Elias said, his own voice shaking with emotion. Because one day you're holding my hand in the dark, and the next day you won't even look at me. You build these walls around yourself, and just when I think I've broken through, you shut me out again. I can't do this anymore. It hurts too much. Elias tried to step around Julian to leave the boardroom, but Julian's hand shot out. He gently but firmly grabbed Elias's wrist, stopping him. The touch burned through Elias's sleeve. Julian pulled Elias back, spinning him around so they were chest to chest. Julian's hand slid from Elias's wrist down to his hand, tangling their fingers together tightly. Don't, Julian whispered, and for the first time, Elias saw genuine fear in Julian's eyes. The invincible CEO looked terrified. Please, don't walk away from me. I shut you out because I am terrified of what I feel for you. I am your boss, Elias. I am older than you. I am supposed to guide you, not want you this much. Julian raised his other hand and gently, so gently, cupped Elias's cheek. His thumb brushed over Elias's cheekbone. When I saw him looking at you, when I heard him ask you out, I thought I was going to lose my mind. I can't stand the thought of anyone else having your smiles, your chaos, your brilliance. I have spent my entire life building structures that won't fall down. But you walked in here on your first day, soaking wet and late, and you absolutely destroyed every defense I had. Elias's breath hitched. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes. He lifted his free hand and placed it flat against Julian's chest, feeling the frantic, hammering heartbeat beneath the expensive suit. Julian, Elias whispered, I don't care about the rules. I don't care that you're my boss. I just care about you. Only you. Julian let out a shaky breath, like a dying man finally finding air. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against Elias's. They stood there in the quiet boardroom, breathing each other in, their fingers intertwined. The barrier between them finally shattered into a million pieces. I have to take you home, Julian whispered against Elias's skin, because if I stay in this room with you for one more minute, I am going to do things that are highly unprofessional. Elias let out a wet, watery laugh, nodding. Julian drove Elias home that night in his sleek black car. The rain was falling softly, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. The silence in the car wasn't tense anymore. It was warm. It was comfortable. Julian kept his right hand on the center console, and Elias rested his hand on top of Julian's. Their fingers loosely intertwined the entire drive. Every few minutes, Julian would glance over at Elias, a soft, genuine smile playing on his lips. When they arrived outside Elias's apartment building, Julian parked the car. The engine purred quietly. Elias unbuckled his seatbelt, suddenly feeling shy. "So," Elias murmured, "I guess I'll see you tomorrow at work?" Julian turned in his seat to face Elias. The streetlights cast soft shadows across Julian's handsome face. "The presentation for the Aura project is tomorrow night at the firm's gala," Julian said softly. "After it's over, when the project is finished, you are no longer my direct assistant. You will be promoted to a full architect." Elias blinked, surprised. "I am?" "Yes," Julian said, reaching out to gently tuck a stray curl behind Elias's ear. "Because you earned it. And because, once you are no longer my direct subordinate, I can finally take you on a real date. Without Marcus, or anyone else, getting in the way." Elias felt a surge of pure joy bubble up inside him. He leaned into Julian's touch, closing his eyes for a second. "I'd like that very much," Elias whispered. The next night was the Vanguard Gala, a massive, glamorous event celebrating the firm's top achievements. The ballroom of the hotel was filled with hundreds of people in tuxedos and evening gowns, drinking champagne under crystal chandeliers. Elias arrived feeling incredibly nervous. He had rented a dark navy suit that fit him surprisingly well, but he still felt like an imposter among the wealthy elite of the architectural world. And then he saw Julian. Julian was standing near the stage, talking to a group of investors. He was wearing a classic black tuxedo, looking so devastatingly handsome that Elias actually forgot how to breathe for a moment. As if feeling Elias's gaze, Julian turned his head. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Julian stopped mid-sentence. He politely excused himself from the investors and started walking straight toward Elias. The crowd seemed to part for him. When Julian reached Elias, he just stood there for a moment, taking him in. His icy gray eyes swept over Elias's navy suit, the neatly styled hair, and a dark, hungry look flashed in Julian's eyes before he masked it with a soft smile. Julian swallowed hard. "You look breathtaking, Elias." "You don't look so bad yourself, Mr. Vance," Elias teased gently, a blush creeping up his neck. Julian chuckled, a rich, deep sound. "Stay close to me tonight." The presentation went flawlessly. Julian and Elias took the stage together. They showcased the final designs for the Aura Hotel. When they showed the West Wing, the exact design Elias had created, the room erupted into applause. Marcus, sitting in the front row, nodded in deep respect. They had won. The project was officially a massive success. As the party continued and the music grew louder, Julian leaned close to Elias's ear. "Come with me," he whispered. Julian led Elias out of the crowded ballroom, down a quiet, carpeted hallway, and out onto a massive private balcony overlooking the city skyline. The night air was cool and crisp, a welcome relief from the heat of the party. The city lights glittered below them like a sea of stars. Elias walked over to the stone railing, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. He turned around, smiling brightly at Julian. "We did it. They loved it." Julian wasn't looking at the city. He was looking at Elias. He walked slowly toward him, stopping until there was barely an inch of space between them. "Yes," Julian said softly. "We did it." Julian reached out and gently took both of Elias's hands in his. He looked down at them, running his thumbs over Elias's knuckles, before looking up into Elias's eyes. The vulnerability in Julian's expression was incredibly beautiful. "I have spent my whole life trying to control everything," Julian whispered, his voice trembling just a little. "My firm, my designs, my emotions. I built walls so high no one could ever reach me. I thought that made me strong. But you, Elias, you showed me that I was just lonely." Elias's breath hitched. He squeezed Julian's hands tightly. "I love your mind," Julian continued, stepping even closer, his chest brushing against Elias's. "I love your chaos. I love the way you see the world. And God help me, I am completely, deeply in love with you." Hearing those words, spoken with such raw, undeniable honesty, made a tear slip down Elias's cheek. He let go of Julian's hands, sliding his arms up around Julian's neck, pulling him close. "I love you too," Elias breathed, his voice choked with emotion. "I think I have since the day you yelled at me in the elevator." Julian let out a breathless laugh. He wrapped his strong arms around Elias's waist, pulling him flush against his body. He looked down at Elias's lips, asking for permission with his eyes. Elias nodded, closing his eyes, and leaned up. When their lips finally met, it was like a spark igniting in the dark. It wasn't rushed or frantic, it was slow, deep, and impossibly tender. Julian kissed Elias with all the repressed longing, all the late nights, all the unspoken words they had shared over the last few months. His lips were warm and soft, parting Elias's lips gently. Elias tangled his fingers in Julian's perfectly styled hair, ruining it, pulling him closer, kissing him back with everything he had. Julian groaned softly, one hand sliding up Elias's back to cup the back of his neck, holding him firmly, anchoring him. It was a kiss of surrender. The boss, the CEO, the Ice King, he melted completely in Elias's arms. They stood there on the balcony, wrapped in each other, the noise of the party entirely forgotten, lost in the overwhelming beauty of finally being together. When they slowly pulled away, both of them were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. Julian had a small, happy, relaxed smile on his face that made him look 10 years younger. "So," Julian whispered, brushing his thumb across Elias's swollen lower lip, "as a newly promoted architect, are you free for dinner tomorrow night?" Elias laughed, a bright, beautiful sound that echoed in the night air. He rested his head against Julian's chest, listening to his strong, steady heartbeat. "Yes, I'm completely yours." And that was how it started. The transition wasn't completely seamless, of course. Back at the office, Julian tried very hard to maintain his professional, stoic demeanor. But everyone noticed the changes. They noticed that Julian Vance didn't yell anymore. They noticed that he actually smiled sometimes during meetings. And most of all, they noticed the way he looked at Elias Thorne. They kept their relationship a secret at work for a little while, but there were moments, stolen moments, that belonged only to them. A lingering touch by the coffee machine, a secret soft kiss in the private elevator, a shared look across a crowded boardroom that held 1,000 secret I love yous. Elias had walked into Vance Design expecting a nightmare boss. Instead, he found his greatest inspiration, his strongest supporter, and the love of his life. And Julian, who had spent his life building structures of steel and glass, finally found a home built on warmth, chaos, and unconditional love. Thank you all so much for listening to this story. I truly hope you felt the tension, the love, and the emotional journey between Julian and Elias. Before I go, I just want to remind you one last time that if you want to support this channel, and if you want the continuation of these videos, bonus scenes, early access, and much more uncensored 18+ BL content, I would be absolutely honored to welcome you over on my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. The link is right there in the description and in the pinned comment. Your support is what makes all of these stories possible, and I appreciate every single one of you. Take care of yourselves, stay romantic, and I will see you in the next story. Goodbye.